Well, hey everyone, my name is Casey. I am not Michael, but this week I am your host on 3 Words, a bite-sized podcast to help you become the best version of yourself. I'm so excited for today's conversation because not only do I get to interview somebody, I get to interview my wife, Jenna Greenawalt, the photographer, the social media influencer, the person who is way cooler than me, and I am so excited for our conversation today. Well, hello, Jenna.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. This is kind of fun. We've always talked about starting our own podcast, and now we kind of have one.
I love it.
Yeah, we can
just take over.
We'll steal 3 words, and Michael will never be back.
Yeah, he'll never know. He's not like right over there.
He'll be back. Well, we're bantering right now and having fun, but the reality is we're married, and sometimes it's not always fun.
And we're ready to fight.
And we're right now.
Yeah.
No, not right now. And sometimes it's challenging. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we see things differently, and today we're going to talk a little bit about that.
I love it. This is why I brought you here today.
Why you brought me here.
Yeah,
Perfect.
no,
I
I'm
love
just kidding.
it. Forced therapy. Could you introduce our 3 words for today?
The 3 words today are don't be defensive.
Don't be defensive. What comes to mind when you think of that?
A lot of things come to mind when I think about it. I mean, I feel like the first thing I thought of with these words is I love thinking about the idea of defensiveness and specifically like how do we manage it and really dive into it. But specifically with the idea of like, don't be defensive, there was actually a part of me that was like, I think that's really good. But at the same time, we're always going to have defensiveness that pops up. So like even in this conversation, I feel like it's a good place to start with just acknowledging that having defensive emotions that pop up is not necessarily a bad thing. Like that is going to be happening because you're a human being. And so I feel like wrapping this whole conversation with a little bit of compassion in that way is important too. How does that land for you?
Yeah, no, I think I'd start there. We talk about this often, but you know, when you're a baby, your brain is being formed and developing and you're learning what's safe and what's not safe. And so in certain situations, you probably learn to cope with not feeling safe by being defensive. Whether someone's critiquing you, whether your parents never gave you enough praise for being good enough at this or that, right? You developed a way at a certain time in a certain situation where you feel defensive.
Right.
And maybe that happens for you more often than not. I don't know about you, if you're listening or you, but I feel defensive often sometimes. Like there are stretches where, and I don't like it. I don't like the way it feels. I feel like it's wrong. I feel like I shouldn't feel that way. But I think something I'm learning is that it is like any other emotion we have. Defensiveness is a natural response as a human when someone is critiquing you, going to give you feedback, telling you maybe you didn't do something the way they wanted you to. So that, I totally agree. The asterisk is it's necessary for sure.
Yes, 100%. Like you have to have compassion because the last thing you need is like, oh, I've got to sort through these defensive bad feelings. And on top of that, I'm feeling shame because I shouldn't feel defensive, you know?
It doesn't work.
That's not helpful. But it is interesting because like, I think we could all form an argument, you know, in our brain right now, why defensiveness isn't helpful for us sometimes or why it's counterproductive. And when I was thinking about this, I was like, it's really like 2 parts. Like one is if I'm defensive and somebody's giving me feedback or you're telling me, you know, a reason you were hurt, I can't receive anything you're saying. I can't like assess my own weaknesses. I can't get that information, which might inform my perspective. So like that's one side of it. And then the other side is like, I can't make you or the person on the other end feel heard and really seen, which is really important because like in the relationships that matter to us and like we feel the most safe, it's because the people, we have trust there that like we're going to be heard and seen with our perspective. So I do think it's a really good conversation to really think about since we all do have defensive feelings, like what can we actually do so that we can be more productive when those pop up.
Yeah. So like relationships is obviously an area in which we may feel defensive sometimes. Like obviously that's why we're talking about this, but I think it's also relevant in your job, your career, your professional life. You're going to receive feedback from people who may not give it to you in the most graceful way and you're going to feel defensive, right? So this conversation is relative to outside of relationships. So even if you're not in a relationship, I think this is helpful. I think another thing that comes to my mind too is, and I'm learning this, and you've got an analogy for this, but like we are never really like taught defensiveness. It's kind of something that we just do in the same way we talked about, like no one taught you how to scratch your itch. Yeah. Right. When something itches, you just itch it. And, and throughout this podcast, you're going to notice now, if I go like this, you're gonna be like, Casey itched his face. But like no one taught me to do that. Right. In the same way, no one taught me to be defensive. It's a natural response. Yeah. And so like you said, first being okay with that, working through that, and then being able to say, what am I afraid of? Like, what am I defending is some language that I've heard that's been really, really helpful for me. So exploring that, like, what am I actually defending right now? Okay. I don't want to give up this. I don't want this to happen. And then saying that out loud.
Yes.
Whether it's to the person you're talking to, if it's in a relational setting, or maybe it's alone journaling if it's in a professional setting. Hey, I just want to pause real quick. And a pause is a great thing to do. Jenna and I will talk about that a little bit throughout the podcast. If you've felt defensive at all throughout the past week, I want you to reflect on that a little bit. Just stop, maybe journal out some thoughts. What were you defensive of? What were you afraid of happening? Defensiveness happens in all of us, but we got to investigate it a little bit to figure it out. So pause and write something down. Keep listening.
I kind of had, a framework in thinking through, okay, when we're dealing with defensiveness, like what is a pathway that we can really work through it? And the first thing is just acknowledge. So what you just said, like, can I just acknowledge in the same way that if I have an itch, like, can I just acknowledge that that's there? And instead of scratching the itch, like, can I take a beat and say, okay, I really want to scratch this itch. I'm not going to. Like, if you can create more space in this conversation with defensiveness, like I'm feeling defensive, I'm wanting to react, but actually I'm not going to. I'm just going to create more space. That gives you so many more options because then you can actually think through the second part of what you just said. What am I defending? What am I afraid of? And that's kind of the question to ask, like, what is behind this? And like for me, I was thinking of examples, but I'm a wedding photographer and obviously you know this.
Yes, she is.
But I had a call with my team recently, 2 other photographers who we all worked a wedding together. And so many things went well at this wedding. Some things were kind of hard and we were like, let's just, try to analyze this and learn from it. And prior to the call, I was like even reflecting myself, like what pieces felt hard for me at this wedding day. And one of the things that was like, I would say semi-conscious for me was I was aware that there's parts of the day where I felt like it was hard for me to sort of like direct and ask for what I wanted from my team members because I was very aware of their feelings and I wanted to just make sure they were having a good time. And like, I didn't want them to feel like I was giving them the dirty work or something. And I was kind of reflecting afterwards, like, I think I need to have a little bit less fear of that, like, they're going to not have a good time. Like I'm almost managing their emotions too much. So this was like kind of a semi-conscious thought for me going into the call. And I like kind of brought it up and it was so interesting because they both are amazing human beings and they were like reflecting back with me like, yeah, we actually noticed this. It would be actually really nice if we had a little bit more direction. And
got a little real life feedback right there.
Yeah, no, totally. It literally was that. And I mean, I'm kind of letting myself off easy because in this example, I really didn't get defensive. Like we have a lot of trust there. And I was like, this is good. Like this feedback will move us forward. But I was very aware, like this is actually kind of a vulnerable space to be a little bit because I'm confronted with all sorts of feelings underneath the surface that are tricky. Like for example, it feels a little scary to think that there's an area as a leader that I'm weak that I thought maybe I was doing a better job of hiding. Sure. And actually they were very aware of what was happening too. Yeah. Or even just the idea that maybe I could have led better and I made a mistake. Like that doesn't feel good.
No. And that's what usually leads to like the defensiveness.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think about like conflicts that we've had. And I think most often it'll start off with like one of us saying, hey, this is bothering me or this bothered me. And the times that it doesn't go well, it's usually because one of us, and I'll be the first one to say it's usually me, like has some feeling I'm inadequate, that doesn't feel good, I didn't do good enough, whatever. And I am so unaware of that feeling sometimes that it comes out in defensiveness.
Yes.
But when it's healthy and when I'm able to like not be defensive, it's as simple as, it's not as simple, it's hard. It's simple, but it's hard.
Yeah.
Is going, oh, I feel defensive. I'm afraid that I'm not going to have enough time to do X, Y, and Z, or that you don't care about what all the work that I did here, or whatever it may be, insert the thing. And when I say that, I can get a little reassurance from you, because I think that's another piece. You said this a lot. Trust. Like trust is so important when it comes to giving and receiving feedback, that oftentimes we forget or we maybe don't remind ourselves of the trust that we may have in the other person. And we lose that, right? Like if you're giving me feedback about something that is making you hurt or whatever, I should trust that you want me to change this behavior in some way, not because you want me to be different or I'm not good enough, but because you want to have a good relationship with me and you want to feel loved. You want me to feel loved, all of those things. Yep. And obviously all of that is easier said than done. And maybe you listening, you're in a relationship in some capacity and you and your partner struggle with this. And I would just, I would encourage you, because it's not something that is like solved overnight. As you hear us talk about it, like the idea of saying, oh, that's a feeling I'm having. I'm feeling defensive. I don't like that. Let me express this right now.
Yeah.
And being okay with that and being able to express that, and then being able to trust the other person to receive that, I think is also really important too.
No, I like that. And I like thinking about it in terms of an example that we might deal with, you know, because like if it's like, let's say you bring something up to me that you were feeling hurt about, and I'm noticing myself start to get defensive. That would be kind of like the step one. Like, okay, I'm just going to acknowledge I'm feeling defensive. Can we take a beat? Like, I just need like to like calm down for a second.
And sometimes that's 10 minutes, sometimes that's an hour, sometimes that's a day, depending on the intensity of the conversation.
100%. And we were talking about this recently. That's actually really important because then physiologically you're giving your brain time to reset, to kind of come back online. You can actually sort through your feelings. So I could sort through, okay, I'm just feeling defensive. What am I defending? What am I trying to protect? I'm feeling like whatever you brought up made me feel like I'm not doing a good job. Okay. Can it be true that you have a feeling about something and that doesn't mean that I'm not doing a good job? Or maybe I am not doing a good job. Does that mean that I'm not a good person or a good partner? No, I can like work through that a little bit more and like come back a little bit more grounded. And that was kind of like the third thing I was going to say. So it's like, acknowledge you're feeling that way, ask what you're defending, and then assure yourself with truth. Like, just because someone's bringing you feedback or just because you did something wrong, like that doesn't mean that, you know, you're somehow a bad person. There's a million different iterations of what you could be defending and what you need to like give yourself assurance with. But I feel like that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah. And I think when you stop being defensive, when you ditch the defensiveness, you're able to, I think, believe the best in people. Number one, you see their true intentions behind where they're coming to you from. I think also it allows you to experience life more fully because you're able to grow and to learn and to maybe see the areas where you could get a little bit better, or maybe areas where it's not about getting better at, but just being more aware of how that affects the other person, specifically in relationships. And this, again, translates into professional and work life as well, relationship with your friends. When you're talking about things like politics or perspectives on things happening in the world, right? We often can get defensive with our perspectives because of our own experience and because of the things that we have learned in the echo chambers that we're in. But I think we also can benefit from losing defensiveness or we also benefit when we do this because we're able to learn more. We're able to come to things with a more humble posture and not just learn more about how we can grow, but learn how other people see the world and learn and grow from that too, which is, I think, really, really important.
Yeah. I think there's like so much there. Yeah. Because it's like when we're defensive, we really can't see beyond our own perspective. Yeah. And that in the end hurts us because we can't possibly know everything. So even in a conversation, like imagine you're arguing with somebody about politics or like something you just like deeply have different beliefs on. Like that can be a very triggering, hard conversation. Obviously it needs to be happening with a lot of trust, but it's interesting because if you can kind of set aside your own beliefs momentarily, like you're not saying I'm going to like not believe what I believe, but if you can just try to set them aside so you can really deeply understand the other person, you're going to learn something.
And you won't be defensive.
Yeah. And you're not going to be defensive if you're open in that way. Yeah. And I think that's actually a trick, at least for me. Sometimes the reason I feel defensive maybe isn't like a worthiness thing. Like I'm feeling like I'm not good. It's this feeling of like, I'm afraid that like my belief or my position or whatever is going to get like missed in this conversation. Like I'm afraid that like if I listen to you, then what about the thought I want to say, you know? Does that make sense?
Yeah. You're kind of saying you're fearing that if I'm not defensive right now, I'm going to be missed. My feeling, my thought, my belief, my whatever it may be. Yes. My perspective. No, that's good.
But it's interesting because like one sort of mental trick that I like to think through comes from this framework called internal family systems, which is this like psychology framework. And it basically is like, can you isolate the different parts that are like warring in you? So even if you can kind of isolate that part that is feeling a little defensive and like truly speak to it, like, hey, defensive part, I see you. You got a lot going on. You really don't want to listen right now. Like, would you mind if you could just go into, you know, a mental waiting room for a second?
Jenna is actually referencing Inside Out, the movie.
Yeah. Well,
it sounds very similar.
It literally is kind of like concept. It is like that.
If you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's good.
It's kind of like that, but like it's just like, could you just wait for a second? And you're acknowledging in that moment, I'm going to come back to you. Like, I'm not going to forget about you, but I just need you to like step aside for just a second so I can actually hear and listen. Sometimes that helps that feeling of like, my point of view is going to just be erased in this conversation. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think we probably all have different reasons we snap into being defensive, and there's a fear of something, and that fear came from us at a very young age. And the reality is, though, in order to become the best version of ourselves, to live the life that we all want to live, or we can look back and go, that was something that I'm proud of, that I made an impact, whatever it may be that is important to you, being humble and entering into those situations and recognizing I'm going to be defensive here. I'm going to feel defensive, right? I'm going to feel defensive, but I don't need to be defensive.
Yeah.
I'm going to feel it. I can identify it. I can talk myself through it. I can express to my partner, my friends, that I'm feeling this thing right now. And ultimately, when we drop that defensiveness, when we aren't defensive, I think, like I said earlier, it helps us become the best version of ourselves.
Yeah, 100%.
For sure. Well, Jenna, are there any last thoughts you wanted to share before we wrap things up? Yeah.
So one thing that I kind of was thinking about is just some phrases and mindsets that can be helpful in sort of diffusing your own defensiveness. So I've got a couple here.
Hit me.
One is this idea, just two things can be true. Yeah. So they can be upset about something, and that doesn't necessarily mean I did something wrong. That can work wonders in just allowing yourself to not be defensive, or even I could have done something wrong, and that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. Two things can be true. And then this other idea is the idea of the 1% rule, which I stole from somebody. But it's basically asking yourself, when someone's giving you feedback and you feel yourself getting a little defensive, just asking yourself, is anything they're saying even just like 1% true? And almost like letting yourself be a little open to the idea that they actually do have something to offer the conversation. I don't need to dismiss everything that's going on.
That's great.
Then we talked about this a little bit, but acknowledging someone else's point of view or perspective doesn't invalidate your own. They can both be held at the same time. And then this one I really love, just the idea in general that, I'm not supposed to be perfect, which for me, I think a lot of my defensiveness could kind of boil down to that sometimes, the feeling that like, I'm not supposed to make mistakes. Like, no, you're not supposed to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. That can allow you to be a little bit less charged up when you're feeling defensive.
That's great. I hope each of us can take maybe one of those steps or a few of them and take some steps to not be as defensive as maybe we once were. Thanks so much, Jenna.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this week you take a step in being less defensive. If you want to go deeper and continue to learn and become the best version of yourself, there's great additional free resources available at dmbcoaching.com/subscribe. Go to that page and hit subscribe, and you'll be given a monthly newsletter that will give you a whole bunch of free resources to continue on this journey of becoming. Thanks so much.